the idea of publishing a wrestling book, in a sense, is nice to me, and the one reason I say that is because in the 80s and in the 90s, there were different times where I was interested in publishing a wrestling book, before Mick Foley's book became such a big hit. And I was always told that wrestling fans can't read. And I sensed that, and those books would have done well, especially then because there weren't a lot on the market. But, that's what happened. And Mick Foley publishes this long book, and, it hits the bestseller list. And then people all of a sudden realize that, wrestling fans can read, and they're kind of interested in things like this. And it's good because also I like the fact that there's a lot of history in these books that has pretty much been forgotten, unlike baseball or football or rock and roll music, where there's all kinds of accesses to, chronologies of history and everything. Wrestling history is, there's not a lot out there on it, and it's so rich and colorful that it's good that it's out there. Well, most people would say with the Road Warriors that their peak would have been before the WWF. I'd say their peak years would be 85 to 87 when they were working for Jim Crockett and a little bit in the AWA. They were a phenomenon when they came in. They would have gotten into the business 83, 84, and hit it big on the Georgia television. Just right off the bat in 83. Just they were big, muscular guys, bigger than, and they could move. People weren't used to that, and they were put over just huge. I mean, you got to give Ole Anderson and Bill Watts credit for this much as far as, and more Ole because it was his television that was doing it. They put him in there again. They put him in there with small guys. There was a guy named Mike Jackson who was a tiny wrestler. I don't know, 5'6", 170 pounds. And he worked with the Road Warriors on television time after time. And I mean, they would just press, and they would, just do this, all these moves to him because he was so little. And I mean, people just thought they were just awesome. And, they were supposed to be heels. People cheered them because it was, they just thought, it was the right thing at the right time. When they went to WWF, they were not a WWF creation. WWF didn't want to be the Road Warriors. They wanted to control them. They called them Legion of Doom. I think that most people would say that it was disappointing, considering people would go like, I think that, in their Japan, where they went before WWF, where they were huge, and with Crockett Promotions and Georgia and all the territories they worked, they were on top. They were equal to anyone in the promotion. When they went to WWF, they were clearly not on the level of Hulk Hogan. Like, people think, maybe they could do like Hulk Hogan and somebody against the Road Warriors, which they never did except in Japan. And, Vince never pushed them to that level. He put, the Road Warriors against Demolition, which was not as successful as a lot of people thought it would be. Road Warriors were, they were no failure. They held the tag team titles there, but their big run, they were making $500,000 guaranteed money working for Jim Crockett Promotions. Think about that. And I don't know if they ever made that with WWF. I think there's a lot of mixed feelings going back and forth. I mean, they used to be real mad at Vince McMahon, Hawk especially. Hawk and Vince, they had their ups and downs over the years. The Hawk suicide thing was horrible, and I think that what was going on there was that it was a lot of political games being played. I think that they wanted Hawk out because Hawk just had problems and he wasn't very good anymore. And I think they wanted to put Animal and Darren Drozdoff together as a tag team, LOD 2000. So they were doing these things to basically have Hawk ruin his own career. And then Animal had so much success so early, and it was hard for Animal to lose, because early in his career, the top guys never lost, and Animal, more than Hawk was more rational about the business. Hawk would lose. Animal didn't like losing, so that made it hard when, in their eyes, they were mid-card act at best, guys had passed them by or whatever, and here's Animal who, still has that 80s mentality. So ultimately, it never took off anyway, but the stuff at the end, some people might say that they were trying to provide entertaining TV. I don't buy it for a second. They were trying, to get rid of Hawk in the most embarrassing way possible. That's just how, they were very vindictive people, playing games in that era. And it's always been a game-playing business, and you try to bury guys on the way out. That's just the nature of wrestling. And the suicide thing, that was going to some extremes. The whole thing of him being drunk and him having the drug problem and all that on television, doing that. That was bad television. It was to ruin him, no doubt about it. I think that they were just pushing and pushing and pushing, give us a tryout. And they said, okay, we'll give you a tryout. They went in there and they, immediately put him on TV with Rob Van Dam and Kane, who were the tag team champions. And they had Rob Van Dam and Kane beat him right away. It was a bad match. And after Hawk was pinned, he got right up, which was the worst thing he could have done. But in their eyes, and there's no question it was going to happen. The Road Warriors back, all the nostalgia. It's going to be a big pop, and they got a big pop in both cities. I knew they'd get a big pop the first time, and I think that the company knew, but there was nothing they could do with them, and they didn't, and that's all it was. I think it was just that Joe, Animal, had just pushed for, give us another chance. Like, okay, we'll give you a tryout. They didn't look good. And the word around, they'd wrestled in Japan and they'd wrestled in other places, on independent shows. They weren't looking good. It wasn't there anymore. It was really sad. It was really sad to see them at the end because, especially writing about them, the week and two after Hawk died, and you start thinking back to just how big they were, and then you start thinking about the last couple of years when, like, I saw him on the tour of Australia, Hawk, and you see him on independent shows, and you see him on, they were the kings in Japan, and then you see him in Japan in these small promotions, in front of very few people, and just not looking good at all. Slow and missing moves and blowing up. The Road Warriors phenomenon was based on taking the whole match and not selling. When the time came where you had to do even back and forth matches, they weren't that good. And then the people didn't want the Road Warriors that way anyway. But what they were before, you couldn't do it forever. They, in a sense, I remember when the Road Warriors first got over. This is 80, 83, 84. And I was thinking, this is a short-term thing. It's not really a long-term thing. And they, because people will get bored with them killing everyone all the time, which is what happened. And then when they started doing the back and forth, they weren't the Road Warriors. But, they had a good run. They made a lot of money in their day. And, I think at their peak, they would be considered, on a worldwide basis, without a doubt. At their peak, they would have been the hottest tag team that the business ever had. I think because he liked to develop talent. Most promoters promoted, and every now and then they would start somebody out. But Stu liked the idea. Stu was a big mark for athletes. If you're really strong, you got a really good physique, or you're a really tough guy. Stu liked he was into that because I think that Stu was one of these guys who grew up. Kind of being a fan of really tough guys or real guys who could lift a lot, and guys who were really tough, when it came to submission wrestling. So Stu liked, he liked starting guys off, and he, a lot of guys who, were athletes kind of wandering around. Jim Neidhart was a guy like that, kind of a world-class shot putter. I don't know exactly where the connection was, but Stu brought him up, or he came up to Calgary, and Stu would take some football players and do that. He would take some lifters. He started out all kinds of oddities guys, and the most famous guys obviously that started with Stu were the guys that ended up being the great wrestlers, like Benoit. I guess would be the most famous, or currently anyway. Dynamite Kid and Davey Boy Smith were really British guys who had already started their career. But they got their break in North America. And, a lot of guys also with Stu was, when Dynamite hit big, so this is late 70s, Stu opened up his territory to smaller guys. And it was hard for Stu because Stu was a big guys kind of guy too. But when he saw Dynamite and how popular Dynamite was, it opened, they started having the smaller guys like Japan did. It was almost like a mini New Japan. And they had some of the best action anywhere in the world at the time because with small guys, fast-paced stuff that the American promotions were not doing at all. I mean, I remember, Stampede Wrestling was low production values, but boy, it was kind of known as territory, really working territory. Bell to bell, Chris Benoit is one of the best wrestlers I've ever seen. Everywhere he's gone, great wrestler. Grew up watching Stampede Wrestling and Dynamite Kid, and I mean, this is the other side of Stu. Is he came and he stayed in Stu's house learning to wrestle, didn't have to pay Stu or anything like that. They didn't charge him thousands and thousands of dollars, and I mean Chris never forgot that, and it was Stu's almost like a father to him, and he wasn't the only one. He was just the one who probably got the farthest and probably, I would say, wanted it more than anyone else. He's a great athlete, but what Chris Benoit has, very few people in wrestling have. It was just a natural love for wrestling and a desire. I'm glad he's making a lot of money now, but Chris went all those places and did all those styles, and I don't think it was ever about the money for him. I think it was always about being a great wrestler, and Chris is a perfectionist as a wrestler, very different from a lot of guys. A lot of wrestlers, they think that their matches are great. Chris will have a great match, and think that it should be better. Eddie Guerrero is also like that. I think that's why they became two of the best, was because of their standards were higher than everyone else as far as like what they set for themselves, as far as in the ring. That's hard to say, because Stu was one of those stoic guys that never showed any emotion because he thought that, I kind of understood Stu as a typical gruff, real tough, old-time guy who thought a man always keeps his cool. A man is a tough guy. You beat up, if you torture a man, because he was tortured by the shooters when he was young, and you survive, that makes you a man. And he would torture people. And I think in his own mind, it was like, if they survive, that makes them men. And Stu, whatever it was, and obviously you lose your son at the age of 34. It has to kill you. It's the nature of it. And he had other tragedies in the family. Dean died young as well, his son Dean. But I had to kill him, but I think he had to keep that public face for everyone, that it didn't kill him. Well, Owen was a natural worker. One of the things with Owen Hart, and it's actually, I noticed a lot of parallels with Owen Hart and Eddie Guerrero. They had the wrestling family. They had the ring in their backyard. They were goofing around in the ring in childhood. When Owen Hart was a rookie, and broke into wrestling, Stampede was looking for a new Hart star because Brett was on the road, and Bruce had reopened it, and he just wanted Owen to be the new star. And Owen took to wrestling just right away. I remember a couple of weeks into his career, I'm going like, wow, this guy's like, he's really good. Then like 2 months later, it was like, man, this guy's like, one of the best one of the best there is. I got mixed feelings on that now. At the time, it was, what happened was so terrible, and it was for such a stupid reason, and it was so unnecessary. The next night, they do the show, and a lot of people liked it and a lot of people hated it. I think that the guy, I think that in hindsight they did it for the right reasons. I don't think that they did it purely for ratings. It was, I think it's one of the highest rated Raws in history, probably one of the 2 or 3 highest. But, who cares now, about that. The wrestlers obviously were sincere, and at the same time, WWE, sending everyone to the funeral and then filming, there was a lot of, I think that Vince saw so much negativity coming, and it did come. It was the most negativity towards the product and towards wrestling that I can ever recall, because it made wrestling look so sleazy when they kept the show going, and the media was very negative about it. And and about, and Vince, trying to be defensive, knowing the lawsuit was coming, and not really answering questions as to, really what happened. There was all that going on. You had, the members of the family who were very bitter about it at the time. So there's so many aspects to that show. I got mixed feelings. I mean, not so much of the wrestlers. There was some stuff, I think, to a lot of the fans, it was a really memorable show. But then, like, the next week when they showed the clips of everyone, going there, the funeral, and the funeral became this big social event that the whole company went to for the most part. It was almost like I felt that the company was trying to babyface itself to the fans too much. It was a bad time for them. But what was going on? I was negative, no doubt. I was negative about it. It's a different world. There's really nobody like Lou. There could be nobody like Lou Thesz today. Lou Thesz was made world champion at a time when the champion wrestled all over the world, and especially all over the United States, and the promoters didn't trust each other. They were a cartel and they may have gone to meetings, but the NWA, this is the early days of the NWA. It wasn't the organization that it was in the 70s. Double crosses, they really didn't happen. They were from another generation by the time Lou was champion in the 50s, but all the older promoters knew the stories and were scared to death of him. So Lou was made champion because in the promoters' eyes, he was a real tough guy. And now, no one makes somebody a champion because they're a real tough guy. Kurt Angle was a great wrestler, Brock Lesnar was a great wrestler, they were champions. But it was because people thought that they could draw money with them because they were believable, not because anybody thought that, oh my God, we better put the belt on Brock Lesnar because, no other wrestler's going to challenge him because they know that he'll tie him up. With Lou, there was that fear there. And Lou was, in many ways, again, like the champion's role today is to make the other guy have a good back and forth match. Lou saw the champion as something real, and he had disdain for certain wrestlers, and he made guys look bad. By today's standards, Lou Thesz would not be a great champion. By the standards of the 50s, obviously he was a great champion because he was champion for 7 years, and to get so many different people to agree year after year after year to renew him as champion. They must have thought that he was the best guy for the job. Because he was champion from 48 through 57 with one break, and when he left in 57, it was his decision to leave. It wasn't their decision to boot him out. So obviously, that kind of a run tells you that for his time he was incredibly successful, and they must have been happy with him. And he, a lot of promoters didn't like him. And the fact that they didn't like him, and because he fought for certain things and was sometimes hard to deal with because he had his own way of doing things, yet they always made him champion, meant that the respect for him was incredibly high. They were a group in Japan who were trying to portray that pro wrestling isn't real, but UWFI is real. It was an offshoot of another group from the UWF that was very popular in the late 80s that went out of business. And they used Lou and Danny Hodge and Billy Robinson, who were three real shooters of their day, to kind of be like commissioners or witnesses or whatever it was, with the idea that these guys were overseeing it and it's real. And Lou was the figurehead. He would come in for the shows. He brought one of his old world title belts, and Takada, who was the usual champion, wore that belt and was the big star of the company. And eventually, the money ran out for UWFI and Lou left. But that would have been Lou's last, I would say, significant run in the business, because Lou was doing angles then. It was kind of weird, because they were outdated angles, but because Lou Thesz was involved, they got a lot of attention, where Lou would go with Takada and challenge all the other world champions of the other organizations, which is stuff that, that's what Lou did in the 50s, because Lou was a tough guy. and it was the NWA's way of making the champion real, because the other champions, when Lou would challenge all these different champions, the other champions weren't going to accept because they knew, Lou was the real deal. So Lou was redoing those kind of angles, and then was a player in Japanese wrestling, until the money ran out, went home, and that was the end of UWFI and Lou Thesz. Curt was awesome. Timing was incredible. I mean, at his peak, Curt had some injuries, and I think that, that hurt Curt a lot. I think that he probably got bitter that he didn't quite get as far as he thought he should have. But incredible bump taker, incredible timing, natural. When he first started, he was good. I remember 2-3 years in when he was a job guy in WWF, and you could see, he did things like the great drop kick, the athletic thing that very few of the guys could do at his level. And you knew Curt was going to make it in wrestling. He was going to be a good worker. And as years went by, he became much better than that. So yeah, I think he just had like, but the thing was he knew what to do, he knew when to do it, he knew how to control an audience. And I mean, his like, a lot of people can do crazy things, but they look out of context. Curt's stuff worked in the confines of a wrestling match. It wasn't just, I'm going to flip and spin around. He made it, he made the flipping and spinning around look like it was the result of what the other guy did. He would do these things where he would like trip and fall down, where it would look like it was an accident when, he was doing it on his own. He had a great comedic time. Just that, all of that stuff. A great instinctive wrestler. Curt had a great personality. I think that he knew how to talk to Vince. I think Vince respected his ability. I think that, Curt had a reputation, and I think his reputation that he got when he really was great carried over for years and years and years, where people kind of thought, well, he's Curt Hennig and he's great. He wasn't as great by then. I think maybe there was some bitterness, or maybe just, the injuries. I mean, his back was thrashed at a young age. He had bad knees from a young age. So, that doesn't help matters either. Oh, Ric Flair loved Curt Hennig. They were together in WWF. Curt managed Ric when Curt was out doing one of his injury things. And then they ended up wrestling each other a couple of times. They feuded for a little while. And, that was, I remember with Curt and Ric Flair, that was always the big debate for a while there, is like, who was better. Ric was more ring-wise. I think Ric Flair was more consistent. I think that Curt was definitely the better athlete, and Curt was definitely the more versatile of the two. But there was, for a period there was the debate on, like, I think this was around 89-ish, I'm guessing would be the time. 89, pretty much people would say Ric, so maybe 90. It's like, who's better, who's the top guy, Ric Flair or Curt Hennig, as far as, United States wrestling. Well, Bobby Heenan loved Gorilla Monsoon. I mean, like, if you ever bring it up to him, he'll make that point. It was, he said it was the funnest time he ever had in the business. Gorilla was a straight man, for Bobby, and they had great chemistry together. I wasn't a big fan of Gorilla as an announcer, but he had tremendous respect in wrestling. Of course, originally he was a tough guy, and that was one of the reasons why he, I think, got a lot of power, was because he was just such a big, tough guy that, when someone needed to enforce something, Gorilla told you to do it. 6'5", 400-pound guy who could wrestle. Nobody messed with the guy. He worked in the office and everything like that, and very pragmatic about the business. He was not in love with the certain aspects of the business, but he was a businessman, and knew how to make money, and had his viewpoints and everything like that. People who I knew who knew Gorilla have the highest respect for him, and what more can you say? Well, you could say that they popularized the music, coming to the ring. Guys had done it before, but the Freebirds did it on Atlanta television, and it was really the first guys with the entrance music, and what would wrestling be without entrance music? Was great. It was a great innovation. The Freebirds were a really colorful team. They did very well in Louisiana, tremendous in Louisiana. Pretty much made the territory with the Junkyard Dog. They did okay in Atlanta. They did tremendous in Dallas. Terry Gordy had a great run in Japan. Got into drugs at a young age. Got into that lifestyle of, a young guy making big money, being a big celebrity on TV. He was wrestling from very, very young. Couldn't obviously got heavy into the drugs and nearly killed him several times. And eventually, I'm sure it shortened his life. He didn't overdose and die, but he overdosed several times younger and died of a heart attack at 40. So that was sad ending. One of the great natural workers too. Terry Gordy, 18, 19 years old. My God, 275, 280 pounds, and just could move and had the timing and everything. He, if he had not had the drug issues, I believe that Terry Gordy would have been one of the great workers of all time. For his size, there was a time in the late 80s where people would say, if you go who's the greatest 300-pounder of all time, Terry Gordy's name might not be number one on the list, but it would be one of the first names that, you'd mention Terry Gordy, Don Leo Jonathan, maybe, Brody Hansen. Terry Gordy, I think naturally, I can't say with Don Leo Jonathan because that was before my time, but as a natural all-around worker, I think Terry Gordy was better than Hansen or Brody. But he didn't quite have the aura of getting over, but he was, he could do things as a big guy and always could do them. It was just one of those things where, he couldn't have been taught. He just had something. He had something in him that, you can't teach a guy. Well, it was a natural thing when Hogan came in, because when Hogan first came into wrestling, he was a phenomenon. There was nobody who had, he had the perfect look for his time. I remember the first time I saw him as Terry Boulder in Alabama, and immediately he caught my eye, and he was terrible, no doubt about it. But he was a big guy, so much bigger than almost all the wrestlers. Then he went to WWF and as Hulk Hogan. And he was still a young guy because he went in 79, so he'd been 24 years old with the blonde hair and 300 plus pounds and not really all that fat at 300 pounds. He wasn't ripped, but he was the biggest. He was much bigger than Billy Graham, who was the big muscular guy that he copied. So Andre, of course, being the big giant, it was a natural feud, no doubt about it. And they actually started feuding in Alabama when Andre and Terry Boulder did a big, some matches in that area, and they drew really well. And then they wrestled at the WWF, I think in one of the Pennsylvania tapings, which was a real big deal at the time when Hogan body slammed Andre on television, which had not been done on television too many times, at all. And they acted like it was the first time or one of the first times. And then Hogan put a foreign object in his elbow pad. He used to do the old that Stan Hansen gimmick, and did the lariat or the axe bomber. And Andre bled all over the place. And nobody had ever seen Andre take a beating like he did in the Hulk Hogan, that very short Hulk Hogan television match. And it led to rematches all over the place, not just in WWF, but all over the country. It was just a natural opponent for Andre, because Andre was finally facing someone who was, not his size, but more muscular, bigger arms, and looked like he could be competitive to Andre. He was a one-in-a-lifetime character, and I've seen a million attempts to emulate him and copy him, and it was just one of those things. He had something when Andre first came along in 70. I'd say probably started seeing him in 73, 74. And it was just the idea of a guy so large in person. You saw NBA players that were as tall, but he was just so large, and he gave the aura of being the most dangerous guy in the whole world. I don't know if he was or he wasn't, but you looked at him and you just thought this guy would kill anyone. And if he ever got mad, he would break you in two because he was so massive. And they used big guys to go against him. At the beginning of Andre's legacy, they would put him with small guys, guys that were 5'7", So they would bill Andre at 7'4". He was really like 6'10", but he looked 7'4" when you put him in with a guy who's 5'7" and 180 pounds. And there's Andre. They put him in there with, against 2 guys, and they put him against 3 guys a lot. So he was doing the handicap squash matches going all over the country. Then he'd come back, and eventually they started having him against the bigger stars in the area. But he drew best with Blackjack Mulligan, who was a good sized guy. John Studd was one of his best opponents, and Hogan, I think, would have been without question. Hogan would have been his best opponent, and they started doing this stuff in Japan when Hogan first went to Japan. Andre was always a villain in Japan. Hogan was more of a babyface in Japan, whereas in the States, at that point in time, Hogan was the villain, Andre was the babyface. I'm talking about the early '80s feud, and I always thought Andre was a better villain, better heel anyway. And he played heel a lot in Mexico as well. And it wasn't until was it '87? I'm thinking, it was '87 when Vince turned him, and I thought, they should have turned him years earlier, because what a great, when he was younger and really dangerous. It worked, obviously. It was one of the great, matches as far as build-ups and anticipated matches in history. But by the time Andre did the match, he was physically destroyed. So Andre's villain run, I guess they felt it was a risk. Andre always drew as a babyface. Why turn him? Until the Hogan thing, and obviously at the Hogan thing, they couldn't turn Hogan. It would have been insane to turn Hogan against Andre at that time. So they did it. It was the right way to do it, and it worked. It was a big deal for wrestling to draw that many people. It had never happened before in this country. I think the record was, let's see. The record probably going in was 38,000 from '61, Buddy Rogers, Pat O'Connor, and to go from 38,000 record to 78, and then claim 93. That was, that stunned people, and again, it's still for North America, it's still the biggest crowd they've ever had. Well, physically, when he gained a lot of weight and everything, he was, not, even by the late 70s, he was gaining the weight. By the 80s, he was aging rapidly because of the acromegaly. It was the only life he knew. He loved being around the guys. And, at the end of his life, Andre wrestled until, I think his last match was in Japan. And, he was like, I think, pretty much, I don't know if he was quite confined to a wheelchair, but almost. I remember seeing him in a wheelchair years, like backstage. When he was still wrestling for WWE, this would have been when he was doing the really short matches with Ultimate Warrior towards the end of his career. And he would always hang by the ropes so he could hold on to the ropes to keep him up. And it was actually quite a sad sight to see someone like that. But if he had the money, you know what I'm saying? He had the money. If he wanted not to wrestle, he could stay at his farm and not wrestle. Clearly, he liked getting out, and he liked being around the wrestlers, and it was the only life he knew. You never know about those stories. Wrestling stories are all so exaggerated. That story will probably be 200 beers by 10 years from now. I don't know. Many of the Andre stories sound totally implausible, because they get exaggerated to, from 119 beers in a night to 119 beers in an hour, and then you start thinking there's no way. But he had an incredible propensity, for drinking. He had, the tolerance and everything. He could drink incredible amounts, no doubt about it. Whether the tall stories are true, I'm sure they're not. But, I'm sure that the real stories are pretty amazing too. Wahoo's whole career as a wrestler were kind of peak years. I guess it depended on the territory, but he was always a drawing card. He was a star everywhere he went because he had the football name. And in those days, there was more of a football wrestling crossover. If you were an NFL player, and he was not a superstar in football, but because he played in New York in '64 and he had the name Wahoo McDaniel, and he was a colorful guy that all the football fans knew Wahoo McDaniel. They just knew the name. And all the wrestling fans knew Wahoo McDaniel. And, he knew how to play Wahoo McDaniel. Was a wild, crazy guy, and very, very competitive guy. But as far as his peak, I would say from really when he started in wrestling, because he came from football, throughout until he just got too old. you know, and then he stayed too long, but he didn't know what else to do. But big star. You know, his stuff with Johnny Valentine obviously would be the most legendary stuff of his career. But he was Ric Flair's first great opponent, I think, too, when Ric really got over as a single star. You know, Wahoo was a big bleeder always his whole career, and it was a Great American Bash, not a pay-per-view, but a show at the Vet Stadium in Philadelphia in '86, I believe, in the summer of '86, maybe '85, I don't remember exactly, but he bladed himself, and the blade got caught in his forehead, and J.J. Binns, who was the commissioner, you know, he was just so repulsed because this is when Crockett Promotions they were competing with Vince McMahon, and Vince McMahon didn't do blood hardly at all. And Crockett, those guys, they bled and bled and bled. That was the whole thing. They would have 10 guys bleed on a show. It was ridiculous. But again, in real violent cities like Baltimore and especially Philadelphia, it was working. The Philadelphia fans, you know, a lot of Philadelphia fans loved that blood because they weren't getting it from Vince. And you know, when the Crockett and Vince were warring in that city, and it was a tight war, and there were times when Crockett was even ahead a little bit. Vince was ahead more, but it was a real dogfight, and you know, that stopped it because that was when, from that point forward, you know, they did not allow blading in Pennsylvania for a long time, and you know, you know, because of J.J. Binns on the commission, seeing that and just being revolted, he wanted to stop the show, and they, you know, basically promised, well, no more blood, and we got to keep the show going. That would have been it if they'd stopped the show. What a riot that would have been, you know, because they had over 10,000 people, and it was only midway through the show. Tim Woods it was an interesting gimmick because masked guys were usually heels in those days. And Tim Woods was like the man all in white, Mr. Wrestling, the pure wrestler, you know, the guy who the gimmick was that he was hiding his identity because if the wrestlers knew who he was, nobody would face him because they knew he was such a great wrestler. And he did, you know, all the, you know, scientific wrestling is what it was called then, technical wrestling. And, you know, he was very successful in Omaha, you know, obviously his most successful in Atlanta, successful in Florida, and, you know, eventually unmasked. He was not as big a star once he lost his mask. But, you know, definitely for a while there, he was the Georgia wrestling legend of the early 70s. Plane crash, he was in the plane crash with Ric Flair and Valentine, got hurt really bad. Came back to wrestle very quickly. I mean, legend has it he was like wrestling the next night. That's not true. But he checked himself out of the hospital right away. The thing with the plane crash is that the wrestlers in the plane, for the most part, Flair and Johnny Valentine, they were heels. And, you know, of course, Tim Woods was a babyface. So he said that he told the police his name was George Burrell Wooden, which was his real name. And he was a promoter. And people didn't know George Burrell Wooden was Tim Woods. So, a lot of people didn't put two and two together. Some people did, and when the word kind of got out, that's when they rushed him back on TV, you know, and put him on there, you know, right away, you know, as quick as they could, so people would go, oh, he couldn't have been, you know, that plane crash because he's already on TV. Oh, in their day, they were probably number one because they changed wrestling. In both the U.S. and Japan. I mean, there's a lot of guys who changed it, but they were a real influence as far as the really big moves and the high impact style. More Dynamite than Davey. I mean, Dynamite was just, you know, I mean, when I really look back, just a phenomenal influence on wrestling. Davey Boy was more of his tag team partner, but you know, Davey was like a Dynamite clone almost. So, you know, but the British Bulldogs you know, I mean, like the thing with it was more of a tag team era in the 80s. You know, there were so many more great tag teams as compared to now when, you know, if a team like the British Bulldogs came along, you know, like 8 weeks into their run, they would already hit them feuding. You know what I'm saying? You know, I mean, if you remember, like the British Bulldogs, and they ended up feuding in Calgary years later, but they never even feuded in WWF, and they were together for years. So, but that's just and they never feuded in Japan, and they were together for years. So it's just the mentality of now, one of the reasons why you don't have the great tag teams is because they break them up so fast as soon as they get some momentum going. Davey Boy Smith as a wrestler was as good as he was motivated to be. When Davey Boy Smith got someone to light a fire on him, under him, like Brett or Shawn Michaels, and they wanted to have a good match, Davey Boy could stay with anyone. And Bret Hart, Davey Boy Smith match at Wembley Stadium, one of the most famous matches, one of the, I've seen Davey in many, many great matches. Many. When Owen Hart and Davey Boy Smith were a tag team, they had many great matches. When he wanted to be, when he didn't want to be, or when he was, he just, I don't want to say faked his way through it. That's not really a fair term, but he wasn't. I've seen many, many matches where he wasn't great. So it was what Davey Boy's mentality was. Unfortunately, towards the end of his career, Davey was I guess the injuries and the drugs, but from, I'd say, 97 on, he was brutal. He was, the drugs just changed him. I mean, he was so bad. He was literally embarrassing to watch. And I mean, that's really sad to say for someone who was so good. He had matches in '97 where he was so good, and he had matches in '98 where he was in WCW where he was so bad. Davey was unusual. I mean, he wasn't the only one like that by any means, but Davey was carrying a lot more weight than he needed to, and he had this mentality. I think because he was a smaller guy naturally. A lot of the smaller guys in wrestling, even today, have this mentality because they're small that they got to get bigger. They got to get bigger. They got to get bigger. Because I remember talking to wrestlers who had no need to get bigger, and they were doing stuff and they were getting bigger, and they would go, "But I'm bigger. How come they're not pushing me more?" And it's like, because you're really not any better. But the mentality is that like that's how you get your push. And Davey should have never been more than probably 235 ever at any point in time. He would have been a great wrestler at 235. He had a great physique at 235. I mean, and then he needed steroids to be 235, probably too, because again, he's not a naturally big guy, although he's a very, very strong guy for his size. And he's out there at 270, getting, blowing up really fast, not wrestling the way he should, because he thought that, the whole thing was, he wanted to be a big power wrestler because he thought that those were the guys that made the money and that were on top. Well, Blassie was the great interview of his time. He was huge in Georgia in the 50s, but he really hit his stride when he came to California in 1960 and Pencil Neck Geek, and he hung around with the movie stars, and he was kind of I wouldn't go say like crossover like guys became like later, but more than anyone else was then. He had the tan and the look. And he knew how to sell himself as a star. He looked like a star. Did the interviews. Great drawing card. Made the Los Angeles territory. I mean, when he was in Los Angeles, for the most part, business was good, and when he left, business got bad. So one of the I'd say when you're talking about the all-time great heels, Freddie Blassie would be right near the top of that list. In that they revolved it around themselves, never created another star. And then, Sheik had an interesting act, and obviously it worked for years because he became a superstar. But after a certain amount of time, his act stopped working. Every match, Sheik's matches were similar. He would go in there, and then they were usually short matches. He would take his foreign object, the pencil, slice up the guy's head, the guy would get the pencil, come back, the Sheik would bleed. High action, really intense. People hated the Sheik, and then they would do some sort of a gimmicked finish, and sometimes 5 minutes, and sometimes even less, sometimes a little more, and people just burned out on the same thing over and over again, week in and week out, and he got old, and the territory died. That's not that unusual. That's the history of a lot of territories. Detroit may be more famous because, it just hit that wall where all of a sudden people just weren't going to pay to see the Sheik anymore, but the Sheik only knew how to promote the Sheik. Well, he trained both of them, although, like Rob Van Dam's wrestling style is absolutely nothing like the Sheik. I mean, the Sheik probably taught him, certain type of respect for the business. I think the Sheik was actually a bad influence on Sabu because Sabu adopted the Sheik's 1970s mentality about, not doing jobs and how a superstar acts, that by the 90s, it was just a different business. And he would go to the Sheik because he had so much respect for him for advice on what to do. And the Sheik would give him the advice that the Sheik would have done in the 70s that did work well for the Sheik, but it was the wrong advice for Sabu. But, he was his nephew and helped break him in. And, Sabu was a phenomenon for a short period of time too, but he was never, like the Sheik. The Sheik had, he was big from the 50s through the, all through the 70s, and even in the 80s in certain places, and in Japan. The Sheik and Onita in the 90s when the Sheik was like, 60 years old, almost 70 years old. They still, he meant business because it was the Sheik coming to those shows, those house shows. It was like amazing to me to go into those, because I went to some of those shows to see the Sheik drop. He drew people when he was like, could not move at all, both hips done and everything like that. And just an old man, but those people, and it was just the right thing at the right time. He was, he was nostalgia, but they still, I guess, got off on the danger. I remember going through, he was sort of scary, because he'd have the fireballs around, he'd be chasing you around. And, he had an aura, no doubt about it. Yeah, not among wrestlers, though. If you talk about wrestlers that were around in the 70s, Johnny Valentine is another one. He's like, like Danny Hodge or Ray Stevens. Those are guys who, among the wrestlers, were much bigger stars than they were among the fans. Although Johnny Valentine went all over the world and was always a star everywhere he went. He had a huge name, in the 60s and 70s. Valentine was one of the biggest names in the business, but it's just, wrestling history didn't really live. And older fans, Johnny Valentine's legendary to them. But yeah, among younger fans, no, because wrestling doesn't have history. Johnny Valentine, Ray Stevens, those names, they're, Tim Woods, those names are not known among today's fans at all, because, wrestling's history has been erased. Vince McMahon now kind of wants to bring it back, but it's kind of too late, I think. And watching those old tapes, it's not going to hold up. It's just a different business. But at the business, for what the business was at that time, evidently, Johnny Valentine was one of the masters of psychology, because he had a different style from everybody else. He would do the beginning of those Johnny Valentine matches were slow. Nothing happened, and then he would get up and do something and the people were ready. But obviously, he had to have the personality or the respect of those fans to sit through that stuff and not go to the concession stand, and when the action started getting, not have been bored to death before they started getting up and doing the stuff. He did ribs that involved feces and really just gross stuff. He was a different character. In the ring, obviously he was really good at what he did. Outside the ring, he was a strange guy. He was obviously a very bright guy, but I don't know. He beat to a different drum, that's for sure. A lot of guys didn't socialize with him, and he played his character a lot. Like among the wrestlers, he played his character. So, but they respected him so much for his ability. I talked to older wrestlers, like Dory Funk Jr., Jack Briscoe, who would have been the world champions of those time. And you ask them. Valentine's one of the first names out of their mouths as to when you go like, who are the great workers, who's the greatest guys you were against. That's one of the first guys out of both of their mouths, and not just them. Ric Flair and all of the guys from when you talk about that era, he had incredible respect among his peers. No, not that character. No, it was a different time. There were more, her role was more of a fairy tale princess. Now it's, the subtlety is not there. They want, Elizabeth was a thin, pretty fit, very, very pretty woman. And they're looking for more outrageous and all the surgeries and, no. She got over because she was the first one. She was supposed to be a heel. She got over as a baby face so big that they made her a baby face. And it was just one of those characters that worked for its time. I don't think so. I don't think she was really cut out for that. She really wasn't cut out for wrestling. She was just like in the right place at the right time with the right gimmick, and it clicked. And when she came back the second time, it was clearly for money, and they had no idea what to do with her, and they just kind of, I think they kept her around because it made Lex Luger happy, and they could do some feuds with Randy Savage over her and stuff. The Ric Flair Randy Savage feud when Elizabeth managed Ric Flair, so Elizabeth was a heel then. That was a good dynamic, and it really helped WCW. So in that sense, she was effective there. So maybe they did do the right thing, and then they just ran out of things for her, and she just she was an accoutrement by the end, though. They were together at the end, for WCW. They got together. She got into the fitness stuff. I mean, like, she would train with Lex and all that. And, I guess they spiraled downward together. It was the Luger thing, Luger surprised me because Lex Luger was a cocky guy. Nobody liked him. He was very, very arrogant. Very few friends in wrestling. Obviously he had nothing going for him except he had the great body and the great look, and he made tons of money for years doing that. And I always envisioned, he never really had the passion for the wrestling. He was not a good wrestler. I always envisioned Lex Luger, however, as being one of the happy endings in the sense of he made his money in wrestling. He's going to walk away from wrestling without any regrets in the sense of, he never liked it anyway. So when, a lot of guys leaving wrestling is so mentally hard for them. So he was going to be I thought he would be a guy who, would retire, have money, and, live a very comfortable, good life. He made money in the gym and everything like that. And, instead he turned out to be, a tragic figure. There were guys, I remember guys, and this isn't the worst. I remember seeing guys, when they would come to the Bay Area where I lived, and guys who I would know. And they had been on the road like 28 straight days, and they were zombies. I would see, it was just incredible. It wasn't even the physical abuse of the wrestling, because actually the physical abuse of the wrestling I think is harder now because the standards or the expectations of the fans are higher. But the travel was just so ungodly in those days. Yeah, I would say that there were guys doing 300 days a year. There were guys that did over 300 days a year on the road, and you're doing that many matches. And then they were doing, double shots some Saturdays, double shots a lot of Sundays, afternoon and evening in different cities. So you're, just imagine that. And then going, doing the long TVs where they would do the 4-hour TVs for a month, and because they would tape one TV, the TVs that would go for a month the way that they did the business then. It was just rough on that mental drain aspect, and there was a drug use. It was also more of a drug culture of a business in the 80s with the cocaine, and so I think that the drug usage was far worse then. Nevertheless, the deaths from the drugs seemed to hit more in the late 90s than in the 80s, and some of it were the guys from the 80s that hit their early 40s. We saw it with the Curt Hennig, Rick Rude type of guys, but then there have been a lot of young guys that weren't even around. A lot of times they want to blame the 80s, but there are actually far more deaths in the 90s of guys that weren't even around in the 80s. So the death thing was not, when it got, I don't want to say easier, but that schedule was not as much of a cause of these deaths as I think people would like to say, because they got worse after the schedule eased up. And the guys who are dying now, not for the most part, never lived that schedule. Now I would say probably a WWE guy or a tour would do 160 dates a year, and the guys rotate on and off, and guys get hurt. So there aren't that many guys that are really doing even close to 160 days. Maybe 130, 140. It's a far cry from 300. But I think they have to put a little bit more into each match than they did. Well, definitely more because of the nature of the television matches are much harder. The television matches, in the 80s, you just went in there, you went for 3 minutes, you kicked a guy around. I mean, now it's up, down, and long television matches and main event, arena main event quality television matches, along with the monthly pay-per-views and everything like that. So there's a lot more emphasis on more big matches. In the old days, you would have your house show matches were more important than they are now, but the standard of what you needed to do wasn't any higher than it is now. And your pay-per-view matches, the standard was really high, but you did maybe 4 of those a year. Now you're doing 12 of those a year plus 52 television shoots a year. So, the pressure on having good matches now is far higher than it ever was. Plus because of the internet and everything like that, and not just the internet, but just a smarter fan base that wants good matches. Whereas before, there were fans, of course, that wanted good matches, but it was more into seeing celebrities live. Now the celebrities live isn't enough; they got to produce. There's going to be some, no matter what, because it's a very physical sport. But I mean, the problem with the wrestling is that wrestling's not the only physical sport in the world. I mean, football is it's different. It's a different kind because wrestling, it's night after night, and there's no off season, both of which are killers. I think that there have been steps to make it less emphasis on crazy bumps like we had a few years ago. That was real tough when everybody was doing, can you top this? Go through more tables, go from higher heights. That's the kind of stuff that's really going to mess you up, when you're trying to top it, and then you're just taking painkillers to get through. Making it more, telling a story in the ring and all that. It's harder for some fans to watch it, but it was a necessary change that WWE made, just recently. So it helps. Nevertheless, it's always going to be there, and the matches, they're still physically hard. People are always going to be doing pain pills to get through it. Plus the schedule, doing that travel schedule. It's not as hard as it once was. It's not as hard as the 80s. It's still pretty darn hard. And I think the thing is management alert to when it comes from a couple of pills, and you can do that to the level where you become, it becomes dangerous to your health. And I don't know, I think that since the death of Brian Pillman in WWE, I think that they certainly are aware and don't want something like that to happen again. And I think that they're more alert to it than they've been in the past. The industry as a whole is such a renegade industry, and no one, on the independent level, that's as wild as ever, and I don't see anything changing that because no one's a promoter can't take responsibility for a guy that he books, once every month or two. So at that level, I don't, and also at the independent level, guys are trying so hard to get noticed that they are going to do crazier things. There's no Vince McMahon to say, no, you don't need to do it, or other people in WWE, like there is in WWE. So I think that we're going to see more, but it'll be more on the smaller level than at WWE level. Hopefully it goes away completely. We don't have a lot of problems in the future. As far as the personalities that are involved in wrestling, I think that there's something to some of that. I mean, there are straight-laced people that get into professional wrestling, but they're very rare. Most people that get into professional wrestling are generally going to be wild people looking for attention, looking for the thrills. And also, unlike in a team sport structure, there's really, not that much discipline to it. And there's a lot of physical pain from day one in training school. You just beat your body up over and over and over again. That's how you learn to be a wrestler. And then the lifestyle of these guys is to go out and party. I mean, I think that's considered almost the fringe benefit of wrestling on the independent level is that type of a thing. You go out and so I think that the personalities that get into wrestling to a degree are going to tend towards that too. Yeah, definitely. The deal with the wrestlers, it's really kind of sad because if you're around any wrestler who's over the age of 40 or a tail end of their career, they really wish that they had done something, and stuck together when they were younger. I mean, even like the biggest stars, who have money, sit there and I mean, every one of them will say, it's really too bad that we didn't get a pension program or anything like that. But the guys, when they're 25 and 30 years old and they're making huge money and they're on top, they don't think like that. And that's when they have the leverage to do it. So it's a real tough deal. With one company, with one major company, with Vince McMahon and everything like that, in so much control, it would be very, very difficult for the guys because they're afraid of their position, they're afraid of rocking the boat. So I don't see it anytime soon. I think that, those things, wrestlers, there's no union for wrestlers, and that's step one, to do that, and I don't know too many businesses of that size where there's so much money. I mean, there are, I'm sure, but no sport, that's for sure, of that size with that kind of money at stake where there's no union at all. Boxers, I don't think, have a union. But wrestlers are more, boxers only, box every now and then. Wrestling's like it's a full-time job, a very full-time job. No, I don't expect it.